Hello and welcome back to another Scrap Mechanic video. In today's video, I'll actually be making a number of different creations. On the topic of weaponry from my last video, I was thinking about different ways I could change up my format a little bit. I thought that it could be fun to follow a theme with my creations instead of just doing a single concept or idea. I decided to place down a castle and go down a list of different medieval siege weapons, trying to do as much damage to this castle as I could. Although I considered it, I did not build this castle. I actually found this creation on my left, and I don't remember why I had it, but it was created by Sir Senior de Magia? I don't know. Alright, now the first thing I endeavored toward isn't necessarily a weapon at all, it's a siege tower. This one was pretty easy to build because it only has a few moving parts, but I started by placing down a slab of wood and building up from there. A siege tower, as the name suggests, is a tower that was built with the idea of being moved around in order to siege a fortress. In my research, it basically has been used as long as there have been fortresses to climb. There's usually a ladder of some kind on the rear, and the front is fortified with leather and metal to make it more durable and flame retardant. You would push it up against the wall of a castle, and optionally drop a plank to walk across, and then you could enter. Obviously, this would likely be preceded and followed by lots of bloodshed, but I'm going to assume that part is well known and focus on just the creations. As I've been talking, I was building up the base of the tower in the background. The next thing I added was that swinging plank, as I mentioned. I put some blocks and bearings on the sides with a slab of wood in the middle. Attached to this, I put a line of cardboard that connected to the rest of the tower. The idea is that you can use your hammer to break the cardboard, my stand-in for cutting a rope, and this causes the plank to fall, allowing you to walk across. The closest thing we have to leather in Scrap Mechanic is walk meat, so I chose to use this rusty metal block to fortify the tower, giving the archers some holes to shoot through on the top platform. Now, something you may notice with all of the creations today is that they probably have engines on them, something I'm pretty confident a medieval blacksmith didn't have access to. A number of them also have logic blocks. I assure you this isn't because I think they had them at the time. I added these parts because I at least wanted to pretend that what I was building worked. That being said, you just saw me add wheels, an engine, and sensors that work to only move the tower when I push up against this bar to make it seem like I'm pushing it. And this is actually the entire creation, a siege tower. Here's me using it on the castle. Okay, you push it forward. The wall, go up top. Pull out your definitely not a hammer cutting device. Accidentally knock your ladder in the wrong direction and now you're trapped. Put in something. Remove your ladder entirely because it's making you incredibly angry. Pull out your cutting device. Cut it off. It falls over and now you're on the castle. Creation 1 completed, on to number 2. I think most people are familiar with the concept of a battering ram, but in case you aren't, a medieval battering ram is basically a large log you swing with a lot of momentum into something with the hopes of breaking it. I'm assuming that the name battering ram comes from the fact that these devices often came equipped with a head made of a massive block of steel or iron in the shape of a ram, but I couldn't actually confirm this. Fun fact, although I thought battering rams were designed to break through doors, and modern battering rams usually are, medieval ones were actually designed to break through walls. Stone can be much easier to crack and break through than wood is, and obviously front doors are often heavily guarded, whereas a random point on the wall was not. Anyway, what you've seen in the background now has been me basically just building up the frame I'll put the ram inside of. It has pegs on either side because that's how it will be carried on people's shoulders. I decided to use some reinforced wood here because it gave it a bit of texture variation, and on that I put 4 bearings. Off of these, I built and attached 4 legs and a swinging carriage. I actually had a pretty cool idea here to use a log from an actual tree instead of building the ram out of wood blocks. If you didn't know, you can weld logs onto a creation, but after you do, you can no longer put that creation on a lift. This makes it incredibly annoying to work with, but it ended up looking really cool, so I think it was worth it. This is another creation I had to use logic on. In reality, these rams would be suspended by ropes, and the men carrying it would pull the ram back and let go for it to swing into the structure. Unfortunately, I can't do that. For now, I just used a controller to pull back the ram, and then when I let go, it swung forward. I added a head onto my ram here as well. I did my best to make it look as close to a ram's head as I could, and I think in the end it turned out pretty alright. I decided that the controller wasn't enough power for me, so I added a piston that it would get caught on and then build up tension. When you release this piston, all of the tension gets released and the ram flies forward, or backward. That is the complete opposite of what I need. The easiest way to move this around with the log on it was to build a block tower and then weld it on. I did this to test it a couple times on this mock wall. I also then added wheels, but that was dumb. Then I added an engine, which was less dumb because it locked the wheels, but it still didn't really work very well. Scrap Mechanic doesn't have physics to break blocks on contact, but fortunately everyone knows castles come with explosives embedded in the walls. Things get a little more interesting from here, as the next weapon I worked on was a catapult. I started with, you guessed it, a wooden platform. I initially wanted to make this the kind of catapult that uses a crossbow-like bending arm to fire, kind of like this one. I believe this mechanism is called a cantilever spring. I tried to do this by pulling some suspension with pistons, hoping that they would flex just a little bit. It did precisely nothing, a common theme anytime I try to use suspension in this way. One thing I think Scrap Mechanic could really use is an inverted suspension or just a tension spring. It would be able to be pulled, but once you let go it would return to its initial size. With the suspension clearly not going to work, I moved on to a different design using a torsion spring. This is the kind of spring that can be rotated, but once you let go returns to its initial position. Both of these kind of catapults are actually quite common, cantilever and torsion. There are so many different varieties with all kinds of different ways to build up energy, but the first actually came only a few hundred years after the siege tower. To do this in Scrap Mechanic, you can use controllers that have been locked in place with pistons, exactly what I did on the Battering Ram, but in a different form factor. What I built up here is a rotating arm that's connected to a controller. Pretty simple. In order to pull this back at first, I tried to use a chain made of bearings and pipes to act as the rope. Does this work at all? No. You can see that winding this rope up works so well that my catapult started to breakdance. What I ended up doing instead was making this controller pull the arm back while the rope winds up so it looks like it's doing something. I added this sensor in the floor that, when the arm triggers it, disables the controller. This, when paired with the piston I added to hold the bar in place, effectively arms the catapult by putting the bar under tension. When the piston is retracted, the arm immediately tries to return to the correct position and uses as much force as it needs to get there. That is actually the mechanism for the catapult completed, so I fixed a few issues, added some wheels, made it heavier, and gave it a bucket to hold its projectiles. Of course, the first thing I launched is an explosive. I was aiming for the door, and I fell just short, but this catapult actually works really well to throw it that far at all. I launched another one, this time aiming for the interior of the castle. This shot was dead on. I followed those up with quite a few cluster bombs. Yeah, I was having quite a bit of fun with this one. After the catapult, I moved on to a trebuchet. This one needed to be a bit larger if it was going to work correctly, so I started off with quite a large frame. A trebuchet is fundamentally different from a catapult in that it uses gravity and a lever arm to throw a projectile instead of springs that a catapult uses. Trebuchets are also far more powerful and able to throw longer distances, making them preferable weapons in many ways. Interestingly, the first trebuchets looked very different and appeared only a few hundred years after the catapult. However, the rest of the world didn't really catch on for many more centuries. What I've got in Scrap Mechanic so far is just a frame that I built up with a triangular shape that I've attached a rotating bar at the very top of. This bar will become the central pivot, and I built a long arm on one side for throwing and a short arm on the other side that would hold all of the weight. I connected a platform with some pipes, and after looking into it, I placed down a whole bunch of what I believe to be the heaviest block in the game, Concrete 3. I'm not 100% sure on that one though, so let me know. After I spawned it in, you can see how quickly the arm rotates, just an indicator of how much power it will have. Onto the throwing side, I built some chains down attached to a basket of sorts. If you weren't aware, trebuchets traditionally have a leather pouch attached by ropes that the projectile sits in. After being swung around, the outermost rope slides off, throwing the projectile. I don't think this is technically necessary to be considered a trebuchet, but I wanted to make it because I'm stubborn. The next thing I added was a spinning wheel. I wanted this wheel spinning to be what pulled the arm back, but that ended up being pretty much impossible with Scrap Mechanic not having real ropes. The arm just swung around anyway and left the chain segments flying around like they weren't even there. In hindsight, I don't think I needed to invest an hour of my life trying to pull this arm back, but I wanted to figure out a way to do it. For some reason. I started by trying to have a controller attached to the center bar. I was actually surprised to see that the controller did have enough strength to pull the arm back, but there wasn't a good way to release the arm without just deleting the controller. But there's no way to actually just turn a controller off, unfortunately. By the way, another thing I would like is a way to turn off controllers. A checkbox that just says disable when unpowered or something like that. My next idea was to use pistons to return the arm, and this did work surprisingly well. I eventually deleted the sideways one because I would need to put it on the lift to reload it anyway, but I did stick with pistons. I added some logic that would pull the arm back as soon as it spawns in, and definitely intentionally turn this into a mechanical bull for a minute. The next long time was spent trying to figure out how to get this sliding part to release properly. The outer rope needed to slide off about halfway through the arc so that the projectile could be released. I was running into issues with it not releasing too early, folding over on itself, and so much else. I eventually gave up and gave it a bucket like the Catapult temporarily. This was just so if all else failed, at least I had this. Back at it though, I tried pipes, cacti, mesh blocks, bearings, and more. I eventually settled on this design, which barely works better than the bucket, but it does look cool. I went back to the castle to test this with some explosives, and after causing it to explode immediately because I forgot to delete some cardboard, I reset it and caused it to explode immediately because it was never tested with explosives. I only realized this as I'm writing this script that these are the only 2 times I ever tested this design. I sunk an hour of development into getting this to release properly, and then just didn't use it. I went back to the bucket trebuchet because it was more consistent, and here are some bombs thrown from that one. This trebuchet ended up being more fun than the catapult because it had more power and could throw more at a time, which is actually 2 major reasons the trebuchet is better in real life as well. Finally, what was supposed to be the peak of this video, I moved on to working on a ballista. The ballista is a much more recent invention developed by the ancient Greeks for siege warfare. Although it looks a lot like a crossbow, and before this video I personally thought it was just a large crossbow, it actually relies on a very different mechanism. I'm kind of repeating myself here, but whereas a crossbow relies on a cantilever spring, the ballista relies on 2 torsion springs. There's a rotational spring on either side of the guide rail that, when pulled back using a rope, both untwist and release their energy into a projectile. If you were paying attention to what I just said, the ballista relies on a rope. If you were paying attention to the rest of the video, Scrap Mechanic does not like ropes. You can see why this might become an issue. Anyway, so far I've built up a platform that has 2 weird looking arms on it. Each of these is going to be a torsion spring like I just mentioned. They'll be on a controller, and as each of them is rotated, they'll build up tension. All of this is just repeat information from the catapult. Here's where I tried to add a rope. I know that under the amount of force these will be dealing with, the bearings are not going to work at all, so I decided to go with a solid rope made of pipes. Onto these, I built a little carriage that will carry the final projectile. To pull this back and add tension, I opted to use pistons to push it. With 4 pistons total, they would have way more than enough strength to overcome the bearings. I added some low friction rails on either side to guide the carriage in a straight line, followed by a rail down the middle to guide the projectile. After that, you can see what I was going for here, and you can also see how, well, awful it is. It can barely even punt a small explosive. I tried modifying a lot of different things here, including one that I thought for sure would work, adding suspension into the rope. The issue with this concept is the rope. The pistons can only push the torsion springs so far back because the rope doesn't flex, stretch, or rotate. I also did try adding bearings, which worked about as well as I expected. I accepted that this one wasn't going to work very well, so I went back to the castle and tried it out. This was the best shot I got. While I did technically make a ballista, it's the world's least effective weapon. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and feel free to subscribe. If you're interested in another video like this, you can click the card on screen or check out my channel. I tried to write this script to be a little more entertaining than usual, so I hope it was noticeable. I also added a bit of a different concept to make a video watcher 5 simpler instead of 1 large. I also did a little bit of a different concept for this video to make it a little easier to watch. 5 simpler things instead of 1 large one. I had a lot of fun with this video, and you can probably expect some different formats going forward as well. I'm thinking maybe some community challenges or challenge maps. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.